I'd like to now talk a little bit about Tlingit social organization and then traditional ecological knowledge. So first of all, we didn't cover this before, but Tlingit gets spelled different ways depending on where you're reading it. So Tlingit, Tlingit, and clingit are these kind of three different spellings. All those should be pronounced kind of clingit. So the L is an aspirated L. So if you're not familiar with that, say the word slop and try to say slop really sloppy. And if you say slop really sloppy, you're starting to get the hang of what an aspirated L sounds like. So an aspirated L is not very common, if at all, in English, but it's very common in a variety of Native American languages, including Tlingit. So you have an aspirated L there, and then you have a T at the beginning that's sort of operating almost like how a K sounds in English, but a little bit softer, for lack of a better word. So again, that sounds sort of like Tlingit. And I'm not claiming that I'm sort of the perfect pronunciator of this, but just to help you pronounce it better. I was very bad at pronouncing this, and then I said it in front of somebody who works with Tlingit people, and she kindly said it the right way without making me feel like a moron, so now I at least sort of know how to pronounce it properly. And I think it is really important that we learn the proper ways to pronounce Alaska Native people's names. I think that just goes along with sort of basic respect for fellow human beings, that you pronounce names properly. And that's true of individual names, but that's also true of collective group names. So the Tlingit people are, of these four Southeast Alaska Native groups, the largest, with a current population of 17,000 people, which is not insignificant, right? That's Kenai and Soldotna, for those of you who go to the Kenai River campus here. That's a large population. Tlingit territory traditionally is this big long stretch, right? Quite a bit of territory that we're talking about. A lot of that southeast region that we're talking about is Tlingit territory. Here you have Tsimshian, here you have Haida, here you have Eyak, but a lot of the southeast region is Tlingit people, traditionally. And I call it a land of quans and clans, and I'm doing kind of a bit of a stupid pun there, but it's partly because stupid puns are a good mnemonic device. So quans and clans, let's talk about that for a minute. What do I mean by quans? These are traditionally one of the ways in which Tlingit society, this huge territory, was organized was through the clan system, which were these communities of people living closely together, right? In modern terms, we would say sort of a village or something like that. But traditionally, that would have been quans. And as you can see, around a dozen of these, right, stretching throughout this area. And these would have been, places where you had several cedar plank houses, which is what Tlingit people would have been using. You would have had several wooden or plank houses set up really, relatively close to each other, a lot of times right there on the coast facing the water. And you would have had, large homes where you could have upwards of 40 or 50 people living in them sometimes. And, kind of a group of people, though, that are kind of all in these settlements, these villages, and kind of also in these broader geographic areas that are sort of living around each other and sort of working around each other and working with each other. At the same time, even though they're sort of divided geographically, they're also organized by another thing that sort of bisects it or cuts through it, a different type of organization system, which is a kinship or relatedness kinship system. And that's why I say clans. So what you have here is a really complicated kinship system that I'll try to explain concisely. Your furlough reading talked about this a bit. So you have what anthropologists called moieties within Tlingit society. So there's not really, some of these things have okay parallels to sort of more broader American society where it's easy. Moieties doesn't. So this one, you just kind of have to let me explain it to you, and hopefully this makes sense. There are certain societies, such as Tlingit, where the entire indigenous nation is divided into two halves. And those two halves sort of cooperate for certain purposes. Like half A does certain rituals together and half B does certain rituals together. Or in a Tlingit context, a person from one moiety dies, and so moiety 1 does a funeral potlatch, but then the other moiety does a memorial potlatch, which is sort of the corresponding potlatch. So they do ceremonies. Each moiety does a ceremony for the person who was lost. They're also exogamous, is probably the most important thing to remember. So a moiety is a two-part division in society where people from the one moiety, when they're getting ready to marry, have to marry people from the other moiety. So exogamy means marriage outside of your group. And so if you're part of the Raven moiety, was one of the moieties, you had to marry somebody from Wolf moiety, traditionally, or Eagle moiety, depending on where you are. It's either Eagle or Wolf. As the second moiety. So you have Raven and then either Wolf or Eagle as your two moieties. And so traditionally you would have to marry outside of your moiety. A lot of that has sort of broken down in modern times, where people don't necessarily marry outside of their moiety anymore, although certainly people still track their clan relationships and things like that. It's not that the kinship system's just gone, but the marriage side of the moieties is considerably relaxed and no longer really in effect. But traditionally you did have these two moieties, and that divided a lot of important things for Tlingit society. And so even within these quans, within these kind of village areas, that you'd have like people from Bear, and you'd have people from you'd have people from Raven, and you'd have people from Eagle, right? So you'd have this kind of like kinship system that was making things more complicated, because not everybody's from the same moiety. So they have different sorts of relationships with the people in their village, depending on if you're the same moiety or not. Imagine, try to imagine this. Again, it's kind of hard to get your mind around if you're not from a culture that does moieties. Try to imagine if in your village that you're from, or your city that you're from, let's say you're in Anchorage, and let's say that you're of an age where you're kind of considering getting married. Imagine if half of the people around you cannot marry them. That's kind of what we're talking about with the moiety. Also imagine if when you die, a funeral service is held by like hundreds of people of varying degrees of being related to you, but because they're part of this same kind of half of the city. That's kind of what we're talking about here. In addition to the moiety system, at the smaller level, there were 30, give or take 30 different clans, and are 30 different clans, and people still trace their clan ancestry. And as the reading talks about, there's a system of ATO ownership, where clans own histories, sacred histories that go with their clans. They own sacred objects, so certain kinds of religious like objects that go specifically with that group, such as a totem pole, for example. Certain kinds of customary lands, so like for our clan, we've always fished this specific stream, and that is our clan stream, and other people are not allowed to fish the stream. And in fact, if they do, as the reading said, there might traditionally, before colonialism, have been very serious consequences, a payment or even an execution. And so clans were very, very important. They sort of structured the economic system. They structured who fished where, who had which lands, who built houses where, who had which religious objects, who had which religious stories. And so they were every bit as important as the village system was this clan system. And indeed, sometimes you'd get clans fighting each other within sort of the quan system. And so within one village, you could have people of different clans that were going at it, fighting each other. Also within the clan system, you then further had lineages, and those lineages could be higher or lower rank from each other, and ones with higher rank would be more likely to be, for example, chiefs or other kinds of leaders. And so, very complicated kinship system. By the way, in case you're curious, all of that is matrilineal, meaning it's organized through the line of mothers. So you inherit your primary clan and your primary moiety through your mother, rather than your father's line. There's an interesting thing here too within Tlingit families traditionally, and this is often the case sometimes the case with matrilineal families, where like it's, so to speak, you take your mom's name and you get property from your mom. If you are a male in a matrilineal society, in Tlingit society, if you're a young man, a teenager, a boy, you are trained, by which I mean trained for your job, trained in how to be a good Tlingit person, and so forth, and sort of internship under your maternal uncle, your mom's brother. It's not that your father is not important, but your mom's brother, your maternal uncle, plays a really, really, really critical, important role, because he's sort of attached to your clan in a way that your father isn't directly. So really interesting. Also, traditionally, you had an emphasis both, not just, you had the exogamy of marry outside your moiety, but then you had the endogamy of marry your cross cousin. So you had a system where you didn't have to marry your cross cousin, but that was like considered to be a preferred form of marriage. And that might sound strange to you. Certainly, and that might sound strange because in the United States, you are legally forbidden from marrying, in most states, your first or second cousins. However, a couple of points, one of which is a cross cousin could be like a second cousin or something, but more to the point, oftentimes these were first cousins, But that's actually really common in a lot of cultures worldwide, cross-cousin marriages, in part because it sort of unifies two different families because they're constantly marrying into each other's family. It kind of takes two lineages and kind of welds them together through marrying back and forth. And also the genetic effects of that, we tend to think that there would be genetic effects of that. They're not nearly as pronounced as people tend to think that they are. A lot of our conceptualization of how genetics works with cousins is based on sort of 1800s biology, which was kind of crap. It's not that there's not effects. There are some biological effects if this happens over many generations, but they're fairly minor compared to certain other kinds of things, unless there's like a really serious disease that runs in the family, like with Queen Victoria's hemophilia. But that's a topic for another day. And so my point with that is cross-cousin marriage was very common, did not sort of lead to major biological problems, but instead kind of welded families together. These are some of the different clans, and then kind of shows how a clan would then be under a broader moiety. So you have, as you can see, the clans are totemic in the sense that they're related to a specific sacred animal being. So halibut, shark, killer whale, bear, petrel, raven, owl, whale, sea lion, and so forth. And this shows how complicated it is when you put together the clan system and the moiety system. Kind of shows all the different... Oh, and then also the quan, the village or geographic area. When you put all three sorts of divisions together, they're calling quans here tribes. When you put all those three systems together, the two-part kinship system and then the one-part village system, and then also add in lineages, you get dozens and dozens of different ways you could identify as a Tlingit person. Now, you might say, wow, that was way more than I was expecting to know about Tlingit kinship. And that's okay. But here's some points I want to make to you. Number one, and I think most importantly for me, Tlingit kinship was and is, sorry, that's a typo, was and is incredibly complex. It organized Tlingit society, thousands of people, into an incredibly complex system of rights and obligations and ownership, and dynasties, and passing along of names and passing along of rights. And that kinship system was every bit as complex and complicated as, for example, the European dynasties and aristocratic system that you watch in shows like The Crown, or Victoria, or what's it called? Downton Abbey. Every bit as complicated and complex as the Hindu caste and Varna society. Every bit as complex and complicated as the Han Chinese patrilineages. And yet we don't really hear about Tlingit kinship systems traditionally in the same kind of way, but it was every bit as complex. So we sometimes think of very large societies with major cities and writing systems. Historically, we call those, complex societies. But I kind of want to push back against that and say Tlingit society historically was, and again still is, incredibly complex in terms of how it's arranged. Tlingit kinship was also shows how Tlingit society was historically and still is today about balance and reciprocity and collective ownership, right? The idea that people own things not so much as individuals but as a family, right? And then that the families are all balanced with each other within the society. So kind of this emphasis on a give and take and a collectiveness, but a collectiveness that's not just sort of come one, come all, but instead highly segmented. All of it sort of based on this idea of things work better when there's balance and definition and rules. And then number three, the idea of a close connection between family, religion, and land. Your family system was where you received many of your religious possessions, objects, and dances, and also where you received the lands that you would fish on. And so we sometimes call this, a Chippewa author, Dwayne Chapon, refers to this kind of a society as a non-differentiated society. And what he means by that is a society where a lot of things get bound up together, like the economic system, the religious system, the political system are all kind of bound up together. Typically in the US, we're a highly differentiated society. You probably don't work with your family members unless you guys own a small business. Your parent is probably not your minister, right? We live in a highly segmented society. Tlingit society traditionally was very holistically integrated with itself, where you had one type of system, the kinship system, kind of fulfilling all these sorts of different roles. It helped facilitate politics, land, religion, feuding, all sorts of things.